All right, there's the clicker.
All right.
And we should have your slides ready to go.
There they are. So you see there's this nice title, Automation Procreation, but after a while I decided that was a little pretentious, so I shortened it to something easy to remember, namely bots and tots. Okay? Bots and tots. Because what I want to talk about today is the intersection of robotics and automation with demography. Okay? Demography is probably the only social science that can look 10 or 20 years out with any degree of accuracy. And my claim is if you want to understand where the labor market's going, you have to look not only at the demand side, but also the supply side. So here's a classic tool, demand and supply. There's a demand for labor, supply of labor. The intersection determines a wage rate and a level of employment. And everybody recognizes now that because of automation, we're going to see the demand for labor shifting, that is the demand for human labor. But what they sometimes forget is we're going to see major changes in the supply of labor as well. So of course we would expect to see lower level of employment in the future, but does the wage go up or down? Well, it depends on which curve shifts the most. And I will answer that question towards the end of the talk, of which curve shifts the most. So, start with the bots. There's been a lot of material in the newspaper in the last few years about job stealing by robots, or a robot is after your job. That's from 1980. 1960, well, the robots were stealing your job back then too. And we could go even a little further back, 1935, where you see thinking machines, and in fact all the way back to 1812, where you see people destroying automated production of wool cloth. But lately, there's another theme that's come out, namely America's growing labor shortage. So look here, construction, agriculture, truck drivers, forklift, dairy farms, meatpacking, on and on and on. There's excess demand for workers, and we have a historically low unemployment rate here. So what happened? What happened to all these dire predictions about robots stealing your job? Here we are, 20, 30, 50 years later, and we're seeing a labor shortage. And in fact, there were two very large shocks to the labor market in the 20th century, and they're not going to repeat. And those were the baby boomers. Here, I'm a baby boomer. You can see this huge bump there after the Depression, after the war. You saw a big bump in the baby boom. And then there was the baby bust, where the reproduction rate went way down. 20 years later, you get an echo of the baby boom as the children start having children, and so on. And that's really an unprecedented event. Well, if you go back enough centuries, you can see a similar phenomenon. The next big thing was women entering the labor market. And women entered the labor market, participation rate of women went from about 40, almost doubled essentially, during a fairly short period, because it was during the 60s and 70s we saw both the baby boomers and women coming onto the market. And what that meant is through most of the 20th century, it's been pretty easy to find workers. The supply of workers was there. But now what's happening is exactly the reverse. All those baby boomers are retiring. They're coming out of the labor force. The participation rate of women in the labor force is pretty much leveled off. So what we expect to see in the 21st century is a chronically tight labor market rather than the loose labor market that we're used to. And in fact, that's going to make a very big difference in terms of how the economy works. So I want to say a few words about jobs and tasks. Automation generally doesn't eliminate entire jobs, but it does eliminate the dull, tedious, and repetitive tasks. So in the manual side, washing clothes. When you look at the historical record, it's amazing how much time people spent washing clothes. It was a very, very labor-intensive and pretty unpleasant experience. On the cognitive side, making change for purchases, memorizing maps, adding all these tasks are no longer necessary because we have machines that do them for us. Now, if you eliminate all the tasks associated with the job, then you've eliminated the job, but in fact, that's very rare. In fact, Jim Besson, an economist at BU, did a study of the 270 detailed occupations in the 1950 census, and only one of those jobs has been eliminated. Think about what it might be. There it is, elevator operator. There are a few around, but not very many. But if you think about it, elevators did not just operate elevators, they did a lot of other things too. They were safety monitors, security monitors, they greeted people, they brought packages to people, they provided services to residents. All of those things are still being done. That is, all of those tasks are available, they've just fallen under different occupation categories. So you go into a big building in San Francisco and there's a receptionist. Well, the elevator operator used to be the receptionist, or there's a security person, or there's somebody who's delivering packages to residents' apartments, and so on and so on and so on. So what happens is most jobs are like this. They're comprised of a set of tasks, and each task is not really very difficult in many cases, but there's a variety of tasks associated with every occupation, just as there is with the elevator operators. So think about a groundskeeper or a gardener who takes care of your lawn and your flowers. ONET, which is provided by the Department of Labor in the US, by Bureau of Labor Statistics, for every job category, it lists the tasks associated with a job. And they're usually 30, 35 tasks. So here's the first page. Gather and remove litter using hand tools, rakes, pruning saws, et cetera, to shape plants, et cetera, et cetera. There's more. Here's a whole other page, and there's yet another page. So now ask yourselves, could I build a robot that would replace a gardener? Well, if you give me enough money and enough time, you could build a robot that would do almost any of those tasks. But of course, to really replace the entire job, you would have to have a whole stream of tasks that were automated. Just like replacing the elevator operator, those tasks move from one occupational title to another. That could easily happen in this case as well, but it's a challenge to do all those different things. So yes, you could automate various tasks that a gardener does, but automating them all is still quite a challenge and not going to happen anytime soon. So if your garden looks like this, you have an ideal environment for a robotic gardener, okay? I had to put this example up. It's a picture of an orchard. I grew up in an orchard in Ohio. We grew apples, and our orchard looked like the picture on the left, which was a traditional orchard. Not quite as clean and nice as that, but that's a basic idea. But nowadays, orchards are completely different because what they do is they take the plants, they're only about 6 feet high, you don't have to climb in a ladder anymore. They esplanade them, so the apples only grow on one side of the tree, and they plot them in neat rows. Why is that? Because humans can go down those rows and prune the trees or pick the apples or whatever. Once they've made the environment simple enough and standardized enough, then it becomes feasible that a machine might do it. And here's an experimental machine that's picking apples. Recognizing the apples as easily, actually picking them in a way that doesn't bruise the apples or it doesn't hurt the apples is a difficult part. Now, once you see this division between tasks and jobs, the question you have to ask is, well, what tasks can be automated? How will the tasks change? Will they move from one job title to another job title, and so on? And if you look at the studies, there's a study from Oxford, Price Waterhouse, the OECD, Forrester, McKinsey. The answers are all over the map. There are all sorts of different answers to which jobs can be automated because people are looking at individual task levels in many cases. The large numbers here come from people who are saying, well, could some of the tasks within that job be automated? And yes, in many cases that's true. Could all of the tasks within that job be automated? That's pretty rare. This is from Technology Review. They put together a table of all the different estimates of job loss, which is quite a useful table. Now, if you look at the US, and I expect the same thing is pretty much true in Germany, here are 10 largest occupations: retail salesperson, a cashier, food preparation, office clerk, and so on. Those 10 jobs count for 21% of employment, 21%. Only one of them is paid more than the median wage. That's a registered nurse. Now, most of those jobs, I claim, not all, but most of them, are too difficult for robots to do now, but you could automate some of the tasks that are performed in those occupations. And one interesting thing to look at in this context is the work week. Because you might say, well, suppose you're wrong. Suppose that it turns out we can automate all of those tasks, and now suddenly we have a lot of leisure on our hands. What can be done? So here's a chart showing you the work week over time on the left. A couple hundred years ago, we were working 70-hour work weeks. The cows didn't know it was Sunday. You still had to milk them. When you look across countries, here's this remarkable variation. In the US, we have about a 38-hour work week. Is Germany on there? Yes, 34, a few hours shorter. But look at the Netherlands. It's a whole day shorter than the work week in the US. And why is that? Because in the Netherlands, they've really institutionalized job sharing in a way that makes working part-time very flexible and very feasible. Like the story is that in the 80s, they had a recession. They decided to try the German model and do work sharing, where they cut the work week by a fraction of time. The recession eventually ended. They wanted to change it back. The people said, no, we like it. We like having a 29-hour work week. And so that is a variable which could very easily adjust. Much, much more feasible, I think, than things like basic guaranteed income. Education and training, we heard that mentioned in the introduction. Even if the aggregate demand for labor and the aggregate supply of labor are in balance, there's still going to be training and education necessarily for different kinds of jobs. I'll skip that slide. Wouldn't it be nice if there were a ubiquitous way, a readily available free way to deliver education and training? Well, there is. It's called YouTube. Every day there are 1 billion, that's 1 billion views of how-to videos on YouTube. How to bake a cake, how to fix your screen door, how to solve a quadratic equation. Here's some examples. This is from Khan Academy. Anytime you want to brush up on your geometry, your algebra, your differential equations, you've got this material readily available to do so. But it's not just on the cognitive side of things, on the manual side of things, it's available as well. How to sweat a copper pipe, I don't even know what that means. How to weld cast iron, how to shorten blinds, how to clean glass pipe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I will bet that in this audience, many of you have used this service to find out how to perform some task, whether it's musical, artistic, culinary, construction. It's phenomenal that for the first time in human history, we have this wealth of instructional material available to anybody who wants it at any time who wants it for free. So that's got to be a turning point in history, because no longer do you have this scarce resource of instructional material. Now it's available everywhere for anyone. So it's really quite an important phenomenon, I think, in trying to understand what's going to happen in terms of training and education in the future. Now, it used to be that being a cashier required knowing how to make change. Irrelevant for a long time. It used to be a writer, an author, you had to know how to spell. Thank God that's not true anymore. It used to be a taxi driver, you had to know how to navigate around a town, or to be a hospitality worker, you had to know a little bit of a foreign language, or a gardener, you had to recognize plants, or recognize, all of those cognitive tasks are now available via your mobile phone, okay? So we think that if the employer wants this skill level and the worker has this skill level, we want to raise the worker up to the appropriate level. Well, maybe, but you could also imagine moving the job requirements down to a lower level. You don't need to know all the breeds of dogs to work in a kennel. You've got your phone, and after a few weeks, you'll learn the different breeds of dogs. So what happens is you can align the skills needed with the skills required by changing both sides of the coin. Okay, so I've been talking about bots. There's a quick summary of the points that I made. Let me turn now to the demographics, the TOTs. There's a TOT. All right, so economists write down output per person as productivity times employment times the participation rate. So that's output per hour times hours per worker times workers per person, gives you output per person. We're pretty much at full employment in the US. Participation rate is declining because of retirement, as I mentioned earlier, mostly because of that. and productivity growth has been rather anemic. If you look at the chart, this is a chart since 1973. You've got a period of relatively slow growth and a period of relatively fast growth, and now we're back down to the slow growth case. So we can't really count on traditional productivity bailing us out. What we really need is a quite significant growth in productivity, that is output per worker, and that's the case, or output per hour worked, I should say. And that's the case where I think we can see a lot of help from automation. This is a very interesting chart on growth of the labor force. So you can see this huge peak back in the 70s, 60s, 80s, and so on. I talked about that earlier. But look at what's happening in the 2020s. 2020s, 2030, 2040, 2020s, we're seeing the lowest growth in the labor force ever in the US since they started measuring it. So it's going to be a very, very slow period. And the population is continuing to grow. In fact, if you look down at this bottom chart, you can see the population is growing about twice as fast as the labor force, or the labor force is growing half as fast as the population. So all of those baby boomers, when they retire, they expect to continue to consume, but they're not working. So that means that people who are working have to produce even more to pay for the people who aren't working, namely the students, people who are not old enough to work, and people who are old and don't want to work anymore, okay? So you've got a situation where, again, go back and look at the chart at the top showing you the birth rates, add 20 years to that, because it's about 20 years from being born to joining the labor force, and then you can see what the situation looks like. In fact, I will say one of the important points is no matter how productive you are, it takes you 20 years to produce a 20-year-old. So that was a joke, by the way. So without immigration, we would see an outright decline in the labor force, all right? And I'm not sure the exact statistics going on in Germany, but I think that may also be true there. And the participation rates are going down, down, down. I mentioned that earlier. This is kind of interesting. It's a map of the US, and I have seen a similar map for Germany, that a lot of this is very, very regional. So if you look at Utah, Nevada, and Texas, they are young states. That is, there are a lot of young people in those states. So they're doing okay in terms of worker availability. But look up here at New England in the right, in the northern part of the US, those are basically emptying out. And I know you're seeing very similar phenomena going on in Germany with the East and the West, for example. What is this? This is, oh yes, the labor market's already beginning to tighten. If we go based on those slow growth in the labor force I showed you earlier, we'd expect to see this for the next 25 to 30 years. By 2050, things return to more or less normal in terms of population growth and labor force growth. But we've got this period to live through, and there's going to be, I think, pretty much a tight labor market across the board. And the US is in good shape compared to other countries. So this is a dependency ratio. That's the number of people over 65 for every 100 people of working age. There's the average in the OECD. Well, look at Asia. There's China, who has a terrible problem. I'll show you a chart on that in a minute. Because of the one-child policy, you've got Taiwan, you've got Japan, which is already the oldest country in the world with respect to the population. And then if you move to Europe, you see Spain, Italy, Germany, all having very, very high dependency ratios by historical standards. So this is a big problem in terms of standard of living. This is the China story. This is look at the Great Leap Forward back there several decades ago, and then the one-child policy becomes constitutional, and you see this dramatic decline. And now looking forward, you're seeing a shrinking labor force. So the Chinese, who were mentioned earlier, they have no choice but to embrace automation and AI because they've got this labor force that's just decreasing. And the US birth rate's at an all-time low. This is also true in many other countries. If you look at recessions, the birth rate always goes down during a recession for obvious reasons, but then when the recession ends, the birth rate pops right back up. It hasn't happened this time. It hasn't happened this time. We're seeing the lowest growth in birth rates ever observed since they started keeping records. And I think you're seeing something similar in many of the European countries I alluded to earlier. This is a supply of industrial robots. When you look at the names here, the same countries that have the demographic challenges are, of course, demanding robots because they want to replace those workers. It's not getting somebody who doesn't have, it's a job that doesn't have a worker. And so you're getting the robot in order to produce what's being produced. In fact, half of all robots are in automotive factories, and another 30% of all industrial robots are in consumer electronics or electronics assembly. So you've got these very specific job categories. We're seeing this happen, in part due to the fact that there are just not enough workers in China, in Japan, in Korea, and so on. So which is a bigger effect? I promised you that I would let you know which curve is shifting the most. Is it the demand curve or the supply curve? Here's a study from Boston Consulting Group. They say the employment to population ratio declines by about 1.76% in the next decade. That's the bots side. That's the employment side from the wider use of automation. But if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's doing employment to population forecast based on the terms of demography, then in fact what you see is the demographic effect is actually larger than the effect from automation, at least for the next decade or two. So I think it's a situation where a lot of the people that are doing the modeling for what will impact the demand side for labor, in my view, should not use a zero base to compare it to, but should compare it to what the actual growth in the labor force looks like based on the demographic behavior I've described in this talk. An important point, as the retirees age, they become more costly. So there's about 46 million people over 65 in the US now, and by 2060 there'll be 98 million, twice as many. Alzheimer's and health problems are going to continue to grow. So earlier I was just referring to movement from the employed to the people who are not employed, that is retirement decisions. But here we also see, fast forward another 10 or 15 years, and you have very serious problems with respect to health care, which I think is widely recognized in the world, but people sometimes don't recognize just how prevalent that is. So that's where I'll stop on that happy note, or maybe not such a happy note, and take a few questions. So thank you.
Just a quick announcement on how this is going to work. If you could please, we have a couple of people with microphones here in the aisles. If you could be so kind to if you want to ask a question, stand behind them, because otherwise it's going to take up a lot of time in Q&A just getting the microphone to you. Yes? Okay. Do we have anybody wanting to ask a question of Hal? He's going to take his own question, but please move to the microphone, because that's going to save us some time. Thank you for indulging us on that. Anybody else want to ask questions? Please line up behind the microphones so we can do you justice. Thank you. If you could please mention your name and affiliation, that would be very helpful.
My name is James Bridgman. I'm an attorney in San Francisco, also involved with the San Francisco Kiel Sister City Committee. My question is this: how do we educate the population as to what you've been talking about? These are wonderful ideas that you've presented today, but most people sitting in the Midwest or in most of the countries, part of the US, they think that their robots are going to get them and they're going to be out of work completely.
Well, if you look at the Midwest, which is where I grew up, I'm quite familiar with the situation there. I think the towns that survive are going to be the towns that have hospitals. If you don't have a hospital, forget it. That is a hospital within a small commuting distance to get to because of this health issue I talked about earlier. Already, if you look at the upper Midwest, you see institutions like the Cleveland Clinic or the Ann Arbor Healthcare or the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, these are the industrial base. That is, most of the employment, most of the money is coming through these organizations that are serving a region, and that's going to be where the economics suggests we're going to move to a situation where healthcare is the biggest industry, the most costly industry, and it's going to pose a real challenge. And I think anybody who looks at the demographic statistics will get to the same conclusion.
Thank you very much. Christian Butzlaff, living here in the Bay Area, working for SAP. One question, so looking at your data, it looks like that there will always be enough work in the future. At the same time, there's a discussion on a minimum income, for people. How does that fit together?
Well, in the US, we have very dramatic differences in cost of living from place to place. So if you do have a minimum wage or minimum income requirement, then I think you want to make it geographically flexible, because the economics of living in Mississippi are completely different than the economics of living in San Francisco. So there's going to be a lot of tension, I think, in regional areas because of this supply and demand of workers and employment. Jobs will be plentiful when you have where you have these large hospital medical care units that I described, but they're not going to be prevalent at all in the places where they don't have health care facilities. So having a minimum wage, that seems quite appropriate in some circumstances, but I don't think it really should be a uniform minimum wage. I think it should match the cost of living in the regional areas.
Hey, my name is Karl. I'm doing a PhD in robotics at the University of Southern California. And so I totally agree that all of these jobs that you showed here, like the robotics parts, are really hard and will probably not all get automated very soon. But there are other environments like where mainly information processing is needed, like finance, which are much easier to automate for today's AI systems. But now these environments have very high-skilled jobs that will maybe get automated even earlier than the lower-skilled ones that require physical interaction. Mm-hmm. So do you see any kind of different dynamics that could unfold because of the fact that we can automate these high-skilled jobs earlier and easier, so that people can just get more skills to get their jobs back?
So there is an argument when you look across a graph that has skill on the bottom and employment or wages on the top, you tend to see this U-shaped arrangement where people at the bottom, actually their wages have been increasing pretty rapidly. Just a dishwasher, for example, is seen in the last year a 5% increase in wages. And at the high end, the people that are engaged in robotics or medicine or research, they're getting pretty good situation. It's the ones in the middle that are copying numbers from one spreadsheet to another spreadsheet or doing relatively mundane, repetitive tasks that can, to a large degree, to be automated, just as you said. They're the ones where you're seeing the relatively slow growth. So I agree that that's a likely scenario, and I think what will happen is that people will take on more creative jobs. Maybe it's a race between what the computers can do and what the knowledge worker can do. But I think there's still jobs there. And if there are jobs, if it's a case where really we become hugely productive, then there's always the option of having the shorter work week, as I described, which is perfectly possible to do. If the Netherlands did it, so could Germany, so could the US. I think we're a long way from that, personally, or at least a decade away from it, but it's certainly a possible scenario. Go over here.
Yeah, hello, my name is Flora. I'm from Siemens Corporate Technology in Berkeley. And the question I have, just this morning I read that the 3 richest people in the US would own the same amount as the 50 bottom percent in the US. So it looks like we have a redistribution issue here, and it looks like also that technology, at least at this moment, is also fostering this issue at the moment. So what do you think can be done or has to be done? Because in the end, it's not just technology, it's really the policies that we have that who is really benefiting from the AI and the IT systems that we have. So what has to be done to have a more balanced participation in the society?
So, in my view, if you look back 100 years to the automobile revolution, you had a lot of very wealthy people that became wealthy because they were able to utilize technologies. You have Rockefeller and kerosene and gasoline. You have Ford. You have GM. You have Goodyear tires. You have all of these companies located in the upper Midwest again, where the founders or the CEOs of those companies became quite wealthy. This around the turn of the century. So this is a natural thing. This is something you will expect to see, that you will see when a new technology comes along, offers increased possibilities. The people who were there in the right place at the right time, they're going to become wealthy, just as been true historically. So my view is, I think it shouldn't be a surprise that this is occurring. But of course, you want to adopt your technology, you want to adopt your policy in a way that mitigates that. So redistributive taxation, there's a lot of discussions of that. There's higher tax rates for the rich, et cetera, and I think that's perfectly warranted now, as it was a century ago. So it's not something that's particular to the 21st century. It's something that happens whenever there's a big enough technological innovation that it really has a huge impact on society.
But hasn't the scale changed? I mean, if it's like 3 people versus 50% versus perhaps a few hundred before, and then the question also is, how can you really get these policies in place? Because with wealth, you also get power, and it may be harder to enforce it.
Well, I haven't seen the article you're referring to, but it was looking at a global basis or a national basis in your figure that you cited.
That was national.
Yeah. So I think one additional factor is the globalization, that now it isn't just in a region or it isn't just in a country, but it's a global. Every company, every large company is a global company now. And I think that's going to continue. So you've got two effects, the globalization, the technology effect are both occurring. So you're seeing this amplification that you just described. So I think the tools are there to do it. It's really a question of applying them judiciously, in my view.
Christoph Leutz, a research scientist in Stanford. My question is actually very related, and you answered already part of it. I'll still ask it. So, if our work week is cut from 40 to 30 hours, and then you have 10 hours for each worker created, value created by machines, who is going to own this value of these 10 hours?
Well, I think I hear a lot of this stuff about the machines, and indeed they're very expensive now, but there's no reason they couldn't be dramatically cheaper. So go back to Henry Ford, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. When the Model T came out, it was $750. Admittedly, in the money, in the value of 1910, but within 2 years, the price had fallen in half to $350. So the automotive technology, which at one point was just a pastime for wealthy people who could afford to buy these cars, then became ubiquitous. So everybody has one. So there's no reason of who owns these robots. I think it could be anyone, because the price will come down so significantly that you can access a robot to mow your lawn or a robot to do some of these other tasks that I described earlier. So I don't really see them as being incredibly expensive. Just like many families have a car, many families will have a robot.
Hi, Cornelia Balter. I've been for the past 20 years with UNICEF in humanitarian crisis, and I'm currently based in New York writing a book. The graphics and the statistics that you presented are based on the understanding that society remains oriented towards growth. Now, where do you feature in the potential that there is a reorientation, a rescoping towards more sustainability, towards more meaning, which would mean that some of these figures will completely change?
So it may well be that the population growth will level off. In fact, a number of demographers are forecasting that, because the single most important factor for population growth is education of women. And if you look at the developed world, you see population growth rates which are small or negative, as my graph showed. The exceptions globally would be places like India and much of Africa. But I think even in those countries where population has been growing rapidly, you're seeing a deceleration in the rate of growth, so that the level world looks like it's going to level off at somewhere around 12 billion. Now that may be too many in terms of supporting that, but I think the tools are pretty well understood that generally people do not want an arbitrarily large number of children. They want a smaller number of children. So we're going to see some adjustment in that dimension, in my view.
Sorry, it's probably my English not being correct, but I didn't mean the population growth, but I mean the economic growth.
Well, I see them as the same thing. I mean, if the population is growing, then and you want to maintain a given standard of living, the economy has to grow in the same amount. Now, not everybody will be driving a gasoline-powered automobile, that's for sure, but you'll still see a situation where a growing economy goes hand in hand with a growing population. Otherwise, if the economy is growing at a slower rate than the population, then you're seeing the standard of living decrease. So, okay. Over here.
Johannes Hallamar, I'm an MPA student at Columbia University. I was wondering, as we've heard a bunch of times at this conference, the technological change is very fast now. So also there's going to be a certain friction of re-education and re-skilling. So even though, as you say, people might have jobs in the long run, there's probably going to be a short-run friction between people and the skills that they have right now and the skills that they would need to have in a very near-term future. So I was wondering how that figures into your view of, your positive view of the labor market for the future, and yeah, what other impacts I guess this could have. Thank you very much.
Well, I think what you're seeing, let's take a job like packaging for Amazon or for some mail order situation. What's happened is you'll have one person looking at TV cameras for 3 or 4 assembly lines, and if there's a problem, they can run out and handle that exception. So there's a lot of cases where the human is playing a role of exception handling. That is, they're dealing with circumstances that aren't quite going right. When you go to the airport, they have all these nice machines that print out your boarding pass, but of course there are also a number of glitches that occur in that situation. Same thing with autonomous vehicles. People are talking about autonomous vehicles a lot, but in many cases, there's remote access to the autonomous vehicle, so a human can step in and appraise the situation. So these jobs aren't disappearing, you're just doing more multitasking, watching 3 assembly lines rather than 1 line, or looking at half a dozen autonomous vehicles rather than just the one that you're driving. So I think this is going to be not like dropping off a cliff, but I think it's going to be like people are getting rid of this dull, repetitive tasks that are not very pleasant to perform, and that leaves them available to do other things. So you think about the first, what I like to think of as the first domestic revolution, and that would be at the end of the 19th century, where you had all of these appliances like the washing machine, the dishwasher, the lawnmower, the sewing machine. All of these devices became available to the population at large and had a tremendous impact on welfare, and at the same time freed up that domestic workforce. It was primarily women, so you could see this contribution to the paid workforce there. They were automated out of a job. But wouldn't you want to be automated out of a job of spending all of your time washing clothes and dishes and cleaning and all these other dull tasks and move into the paid labor market, which were much more interesting and better jobs? So that was a case where it doesn't show up so much in the economic statistics because they weren't valuing that housework since it wasn't paid. If you value that housework at a paid rate, you saw tremendous movement from working domestically to working in the commercial sector. I think that's my last question. Time's up. So, oh, he says one more. Okay, one more.
I'm Alexander Kiesling. I'm a visiting student researcher at the Berkeley National Lab, and I have a follow-up question, which is kind of referring to the gentleman's question on wealth disparity. You mentioned that there are kind of appropriate tools to deal with wealth disparity. Could you name some of them and kind of how one could implement them to like limit this disparity of like 3 people owning like 50% of the whole wealth in the US?
Yeah, well, these wealth statistics are a little bit funny because a lot of the wealth depends on the demand side. There's paintings, there's houses, there's all sorts of things that are available in more or less fixed supply, and what the valuation is determined entirely by demand. So if income went down, demand would go down and wealth would go down, right? Because you've got a situation where the wealth statistics depend on what income and consumption opportunities are like. So I don't see that as really a huge problem. Many of these wealthy people, the 400 multi-billionaires, are of course giving their money away, just like we saw 100 years ago with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, all the places that use charitable donations to make the world a better place. That's certainly happening now, right here in Silicon Valley. That's happening. So again, I see that there will be some redistributive taxation. There will be some programs for providing this kind of retraining and education we described, but there's also going to be this transfer of wealth. Remember, all of these baby boomers that are retiring, their wealth doesn't disappear. Their wealth gets transferred to the next generation through one means or another. So we're seeing a huge transfer of wealth, just because of the accumulation from that particular demographic group. Okay. Oh, one more.
I'll exercise moderator's prerogative
Okay.
to ask maybe one tiny one to close us off, and that is we're seeing studies that say new jobs generated will be in the services industry.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the new jobs being generated actually favor women over men in terms of base capabilities, whichever way he wants to define that.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a problem with the wage level decrease because service jobs tend to be lower paid than manufacturing jobs, and women tend to be lower paid than men. And so are we going to see incomes decrease, and is that going to be a problem for the economy?
Well, remember, services is a very broad category. The 10 occupations I showed you, those were all service jobs. That's 80% of the labor force is in a service job, but there are lawyers, there are professors, there are accountants, there are dentists, there are doctors, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all classified as service jobs as well, because you're not producing a physical good, you're producing a service for someone. And there's lots of, I would say, innovation going on in terms of new job categories, your yoga instructor, your Pilates instructor, on and on and on, that people are adopting. So in the world of the future, you might see the price of goods becoming much cheaper because of more efficient manufacturing techniques via robotics and other kinds of automation. But you would see the services becoming more expensive because people want to spend their money on their lifestyle, not just on material goods.
Very good. Meanwhile, we have to make sure women are paid the same as men, right? But that's a topic for another
We'll
day.
leave that. We'll leave
All
that.
right. Big round of applause, please. Thank you.